Good morning to our participants here in the United States. Good afternoon to our participants in Europe. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our third KAS AGI Transatlantic Trade Week. Much has happened since our last trade week in May 2022, giving us a lot of substance to discuss this year. My name is Paul Linartz. I'm the director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office in the United States, located here in Washington, D.C. This Transatlantic Trade Week is jointly hosted by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or Konrad Adenauer Foundation in English, and the American-German Institute affiliated with Johns Hopkins University. We will hold two online sessions or seminars, the one today and one on Wednesday, when we will discuss trade and climate policies. I hope to see you all again on Wednesday. For those of you yet who will not be able to make it, we will have a recording of both webinars available online, and I'm pleased to announce that AGI will also be producing a comprehensive report on the conclusions of our discussions. Today's topic is about the US-EU Trade and Technology Council and the future of friendshoring. We have an impressive lineup of experts with us today to discuss how the US and the EU are taking a more geoeconomic approach to trade. Thank you to our distinctive experts on the panel today and to all our participants. I also want to give a special thanks to our guest who has traveled from Germany, Kai Whittaker, who is here with me in our office, who is a member of the German Bundestag, the German Federal Parliament, for joining us this week. We will hear from him later, but Mr. Whittaker, welcome warmly to Washington, D.C. But before we get started, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Jeff Raske, president of the American-German Institute, for his excellent cooperation and leadership. I also want to take the opportunity to sincerely thank Peter Rashish, vice president and director of the Geoeconomics program at AGI. Today, Peter will lead us through the discussions on the role of friendshoring. What will it play in transatlantic policymaking? I'm very much looking forward to this important and timely exchange. But for now, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be in partnership once again with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. The transatlantic economic relationship is at the heart of global innovation and now also at the forefront of policy dialogue and policy innovation. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today, and I'm going to get out of the way, put things in the hands of Peter Rashish, who will take us ahead. So Peter, over to you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Jeff, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's with us, and thanks for joining. Let me also add my appreciation to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for our cooperation on this year's Transatlantic Trade Week. As Paul mentioned, this is the first of two events, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to register for Wednesday's webinar, which will explore the nexus of trade and climate policies. Today, we are addressing the US-EU Trade and Technology Council and friendshoring. The Trade and Technology Council, or TTC, will have its fourth meeting at the end of this month. It's taking place in Sweden, which currently holds the rotating EU presidency. This meeting of the TTC comes at a time when some of the longtime assumptions underpinning the global trading system are being called into question, and also when we see that domestic climate and national security priorities are playing a larger role in both US and EU policymaking. And there is a growing interest, it seems, on both sides to diversify supply chains and increase the role that like-minded economies play in their trade relations. We've seen in the US, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speak of friendshoring as a principle for US international economic policy, and more recently, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has praised the TTC as a way to coordinate industrial and supply chain strategies between the US and the EU. And then in the EU, we've seen new trade policy tools that are being adopted, like the anti-coercion instrument, which aims to strengthen the EU's ability to deter and, if needed, respond to challenges to its global economic interests. So today we have, I think, a really first-rate set of panelists to help us examine and debate these issues. Kai Whittaker has been serving in the German Bundestag since 2013 for the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, representing the state of Baden-Württemberg. He is a member of the Committee on Labor and Social Affairs and has also recently served as chairman of the CDU-CSU Working Group on the Parliamentary Advisory Council on Sustainable Development. He's a member of the US-German Parliamentary Group and has been serving as its deputy chair since 2021. And before serving in the Bundestag, he worked in the private sector at two leading German manufacturing companies. Fran Burwell is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, where until January 17, she served as vice president of European Union and Special Initiatives, and where she currently directs the Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative. Her research there has focused on the digital economy and privacy, US-EU trade and investment, US-EU security cooperation, and EU institutions and processes. She's also a senior director at McLarty Associates, an international strategic advisory firm. Peter Harrell is an attorney advising companies, investors, executives, and corporate boards on international legal, regulatory, and geopolitical risks. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From January 2021 through 2022, he served at the White House as Senior Director for International Economics, with the dual appointment to the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. Among his responsibilities in that role, he co-led President Biden's supply chain resilience agenda and worked on the US-EU data privacy framework. He's also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions and on the State Department's policy planning staff. And finally, we also have Matthias Krämer, who will be with us shortly. On the screen, he has been head of the Department for External Economic Policy at the Federation of German Industries, or BDI, since January 2021, where he's responsible for global economic development and international trade policy, as well as German and European foreign economic and trade policy and transatlantic trade relations. He also represents the BDI in several international boards, including the B7, B20, the International Chamber of Commerce, and Business Europe. He has also worked as a consultant in international corporate auditing before coming to BDI. So after we hear from our panelists, we will then have a moderated discussion, and then I'll open up the discussion to your questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button on your screen and do try to put it in the form of a question, and we'll do our best to get those questions to the panelists. So to start out with, let me hand the floor over to you, Kai Whittaker.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for having me over. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be here at the Transatlantic Trade event hosted by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the American-German Institute. The focus of the panel discussion is to explore ways to enhance the Trade and Technology Council, and I believe that the recent decision by the US and the European Commission to pursue a critical minerals agreement highlights the vital role that friendshoring will play in transatlantic economic policymaking. But as we gather here today, I think it's important to remember why we talk about enhancing trade. Sure, we want to strengthen our friendships among our peoples and to prosper our economies, but I think the struggle we face is not between countries or economies these days, but rather between the values of freedom and those of oppression. This is, in my view, the essential battle we have to fight in this century. The US, Europe, and other free democratic nations will have to think very hard, I think, to ensure that at the end, freedom prevails over dictatorial regimes like China, Russia, and the like. And if we're in to win this battle, I think we need to do three things. First, let's deepen our trade relations. We must prioritize de-risking over deglobalization. De-risking means focusing on building deeper relationships with our friends rather than simply cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world, even from friends. In this light, I think it is more than incomprehensible and also regrettable, to me at least, that the US is resisting a full free trade agreement with the European Union to such an extent. I know there are domestic political reasons for this. Yes, I see that, and I know it's not happening in the short term. But at the same time, I believe that these reasons are being given too much short-sighted attention. And these reasons, I think, will not withstand in the long run. If America can't imagine implementing a free trade agreement with the free nations of Europe, who else will come into mind? If this arrangement seems impossible, I have little hope to win this long-term battle we are in. And we also have to find new ways to talk between business and politics on how to implement a de-risking strategy within global companies. I think there has, at least in Europe, there has been a widening gap between politicians and business managers, how to think geopolitical terms through their business models. Second, let's strengthen our trade ties. Europe created the Fit for 55 package. I'm sure you know that. The US followed with the Inflation Reduction Act, a remarkable act, to be honest. Both will invest billions of dollars to decarbonize their economies. I think we should have taken this opportunity to tell a shared story to the world of how we think the world should develop. This could have been the moment where the Western world answers something towards the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And it's not too late to develop and come up with such a story. And also the pandemic has taught us the importance of supply chain security and resilience. And we must take measures to ensure that our economies are more robust and less vulnerable to future shocks. Achieving this also requires cooperation between the United States, Europe, and our partners worldwide. And third, let's open our trade relations. If we are in to win, we need new allies. The war of Russia against Ukraine showed us that not all states look onto this world like we do. Too many states sit on the fence, uneasy to decide for which team they should settle. I think we need new allies because even the US and Europe together are too small against China and other dictatorships to be the future gravity center of economic wealth. We need to think about our current international formats and how we open them to other states. If we can offer them a level playing field agreement, taking them serious as partners and showing them how much more they will benefit if they join our team, I think then we will be successful at the end. Of course, this also implies that we Europeans must do our homework. I do not share Macron's stance that other conflicts in the world like Taiwan are not our problem. I do believe that Europe and the United States need to work on all issues together to ensure that other countries can be better integrated into our world and on an equal footing. We are in this together. Yes, that also means Europe needs to step up and become stronger, and in some cases more independent, especially on security issues. Because we are not just talking about trade agreements and economic policies, we are talking about the future of our countries and the future of the world, of which also security policy is an important part. Free trade will only be possible if there's safe trade. And therefore, it's our responsibility to work together to ensure that the principles of freedom and democracy are upheld and that we can create a world where all countries can thrive. In my opinion, TTC is a good approach at the European level to deepen trade relations with the US and also on a value-based basis. And on the German level, we also need to deepen good connections and patch up those that have been broken in recent years. I look forward to an exciting exchange on how this can be achieved and would like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung again for the invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kai Whittaker, for those remarks. Let me now hand it over to Fran Burwell.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to Mr. Whittaker for those very interesting remarks. I am going to speak more about the TTC itself and about the TTC's status, where it is, as we look forward to the next meeting in about 2 weeks in Sweden. But I also wanted to take a somewhat different perspective from Mr. Whittaker, saying that the TTC has not and never has been about traditional trading elements, or at least trade in the traditional sense, that is market access. We haven't really talked about market access between the US and the EU since the failure of TTIP. And even in TTIP, market access wasn't a huge element. It was much more focused on the regulatory issues, conformity assessment, et cetera. And I think that reflects, unfortunately, the political climate, certainly here in the United States, but I think also one of the lessons that I took from TTIP was that such an agreement with the United States was not particularly welcomed in some countries in Europe. But I also think that this is something that reflects the actual structure of US-EU trade, which is based on investment more than trade. It is investment that is the foundation of our relationship. And in fact, trade follows investment. A lot of our trade is companies invested on both sides of the Atlantic, sending parts back and forth to each other. So I think it's very appropriate that we actually try and modify or examine our assumptions about transatlantic trade by putting a friendshoring lens on this. The focus on friendshoring is, to me, very appropriate because it is about making sure that investment is balanced on both sides of the Atlantic. There are areas of friendshoring or areas of trade related to friendshoring that help to keep supply chains open, and we need to be very diligent in looking at that. One of the key elements that we will have to struggle with is what needs to be friendshored. What are the sectors of the economy that actually qualify for this? Is it medical masks or is it critical minerals? There's a big range between those things. So how do we establish which areas we're going to work on in conformity assessment? In recent TTCs, there's been an emphasis by the Europeans and by the Germans on conformity assessment for machinery. Is that something that should be a target for us, given the emphasis on friendshoring? We have CBAM coming down the pike at us in a couple of years now, and there are some key steel, hydrogen, et cetera. These are critical elements, critical sectors of our economies. To what degree should we focus on those, and should those be targets? Having said that, trade has some limitations on its importance within the TTC. I wanted to mark one particular area where the TTC has been active and which I think is underrated. And that is that the US and the EU should not always talk about trade in terms of the trade between themselves, but rather they are both major partners in the global trading environment. And we now have a situation where the EU is setting out a series of regulations that is going to alter the way the EU works with its trading partners. And we have seen this reflected a bit in Working Group 10, where we have seen an emphasis on forced labor, for example. But the EU rules on deforestation, forced labor, and many other ESG criteria, along with the due diligence that will be imposed on companies, will change the supply chains. We already see Malaysia and Indonesia seeking to counter the new deforestation rules. Not clear how some of these rules will be implemented. Will it simply be that companies will avoid questionable countries or questionable locations? A lot of US companies will be affected, and it's important that we start talking about this. And the TTC is one forum where we can do that. if the TTC is not focused on traditional trade, the other big component of its mission, of course, is technology. And here, I would also argue that while the TTC has met some initial expectations, it's been very much affected by the way the world has changed around it. Obviously, some hoped that the TTC would stem the tidal wave of EU regulation on digital. That didn't happen. We now have DSA and DMA as realities. And I think perhaps some edges have been softened by the discussions, but you have to go down to the very specific levels to see where that might happen. And there are still some very real concerns. The TTC from the very beginning was not supposed to talk about active legislation. And so things like DMA, DSA, and even the IRA were off base for some time. However, TTC did provide, I think, exceptionally valuable opportunities to address these issues in an informal sense. And we now have the interesting case of the AI Act, which was not as far along as the other legislation. And there seems to be, although it's not entirely clear, a feedback loop between the AI discussions that we have seen in the TTC and the way the AI Act is finally emerging. We'll have to see in the end just how all this works, but we have seen some changes. I would also, so that's one thing to look at. Is there something in the TTC now that can affect future legislation, including legislation that is relevant to friendshoring? On the TTC and tech, two other points. The TTC is slow. It is looking at taxonomies of AI. It's looking at definitions. And here we now have ChatGPT. And like I think most national governments, the TTC is not really equipped to respond immediately to this type of development. So I think we have to see both how national governments and the TTC together are going to discuss that. One thing the TTC has done is create more convergence and conversation between the US and EU views of AI. And I think that's a good thing. So what is the TTC's value added in this regard? I think key to judging the TTC, and particularly when you look at the meetings now, is acknowledging that geopolitics has changed significantly since it was established. I think the announcement was June 2021. The TTC has provided an essential forum for discussion and coordination of some policies, and export controls are a prime example of that. I would say that the TTC, immediately after the invasion of Ukraine, the focus was on Russia. We now see a focus moving towards China, and I think that is going to continue, but we will not always hear the word China. And so I think we in the United States have to get used to that. I would propose that the informal attributes of TTC have become, in this new environment, even more important. It's not just that the leadership, the co-chairs show up and bless things, but they really do steer things and allow us, when we have issues like the IRA, to address them more effectively. I think the whole European reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act would have been much, much worse and much more sustained in a negative way if we had not had the TTC. Let me also say that the working group structure is a real innovation, but at the same time, the TTC should not be held hostage to it. Working groups should come and go, depending upon the value added that they bring to it. What will it take for the TTC to succeed in the next 6 months, the next semester, if I can put it that way? I think that although deliverables remain important, we have to stop judging the TTC simply by how many deliverables there are and how specific they are. The working groups and the deliverables are kind of the basis for future coordination, but they're very much future, and they're not always about exactly what we can do today and what we need to do today. I think the TTC has to address the hard issues. It has to help with the critical minerals negotiation. We have the subsidies tracking exercise now within the TTC. The green steel negotiation, some arrangement between that and the TTC should be, I think, explored. We will have to spend much more time in the TTC on investment screening and outward investment if we want to talk about friendshoring. And finally, we have to have some way that in the United States, we can think about the TTC as an avenue to the member states, because the member states are crucial on a lot of friendshoring related, investment related issues. It's not just trade and technology. Rules are much more the purview of the Commission, but we're talking about investment now. And we need to make sure that we're all the parties are online. So with that, I will finish, Peter, and I'm looking forward to the next TTC in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you, Fran. Let me now hand it over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you and the American German Institute and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to make some remarks on the Biden-Harris administration's approach to friendshoring, and then also a little bit on the TTC, though I'm going to keep my remarks on the TTC itself quite short because I wholly endorse the many points that Fran made on the TTC. When it comes to friendshoring, I'll begin by noting that the Biden-Harris administration has promoted friendshoring as part of its supply chain strategy, actually since before there was a Biden-Harris administration. And indeed, back in the summer of 2020, when then former Vice President Biden was out on the campaign trail running for the presidency, he issued a set of campaign commitments around critical supply chains that included a commitment to working with allies and partners on collective supply chain resilience. And I think that you've seen the administration try to work with allies and partners on supply chain resilience since the early days of the administration. Indeed, in April 2021, in one of its very first actual trade actions, the administration withdrew the Trump administration's decision to withdraw certain essential medicines from the scope of U.S. commitments under the WTO's government procurement agreements. And I think that was kind of an early signal in a concrete way that the administration would try to work with its allies and partners. I think that supply chain resilience has been a pillar of work within the TTC, obviously in a European context. In an Asian context, it's been a pillar of work within the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. It's a regular topic in the work in bilateral relationships, including with Germany, with France, and with allies and partners around the world. And I think that the recently announced US-EU intent to work on a critical minerals agreement is indicative of the administration's very sincere commitment to working with allies and partners. But it is important to recognize that the administration also has strong industrial policy goals, and that there is an ambition in the Biden-Harris administration to retain America's manufacturing base. I think there's a strong view in the administration that as we transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, the U.S. should not recreate a dependency on foreign inputs for energy that was a major challenge in the U.S., for example, between the 1970s and 1990s, when the U.S. was highly dependent on oil imports for our energy security. And I think there's a strong view that as we transition to electric vehicles, the U.S. should not lose what is left of its auto manufacturing industry. And so I think you've seen the administration take a number of steps to promote, sort of U.S. industrial policy goals on those two sectors as well as others, even while the administration also tries to work with allies and partners on the friendshoring agenda. I also think it's important to note that the sort of specific industrial policy actions we've seen in the last year or year and a half in Washington is indicative of a broader rethinking in Washington about what the U.S. approach to domestic economic policy should be. I think Kai spoke in his early remarks about the challenge of our time being a competition between democratic and autocratic states, and that's certainly a view that's widely shared in Washington, including by President Biden. But I also think that in the US, there is a rethinking, particularly in the Democratic Party, but even among parts of the Republican Party as well. Look at senators like Josh Hawley, or even some of the things that former President Trump pursued about our domestic economic framework. And here I'd commend you to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's recent speech arguing for a need for a new Washington consensus, where there would be a much more of a focus, well, obviously recognizing we are all free market liberal economies, but a more of an emphasis on certain sort of state-directed nudges to critical investments domestically. Now, how does the Biden-Harris administration reconcile what I do think is a genuine commitment to friendshoring, along with its domestic manufacturing and industrial policy goals? So far, as we say in English, I think this has been more of an art than a science. There hasn't been a comprehensive framework that the administration has been following for this is something we're going to do with allies, and this is something we're going to do domestically. Instead, I think what we've seen is a set of steps to balance industrial policy and friendshoring goals in a sort of muddling through approach. We've definitely seen this muddling through approach with the IRA, where the administration has been working to figure out ways within the constraints set by the statute to balance its domestic goals in cooperation with allies and partners. And let me give just two examples of how the administration has done that. First, if you look at electric vehicle batteries, you've seen, as has already been discussed, the intent between the U.S. and the European Union to negotiate and adopt a critical minerals agreement, which would give European car manufacturers access to some of the preferences for minerals underneath contained in the IRA. But there are other areas as well in IRA implementation. The administration has been trying to, as you might think, soften some of the edges. For example, adopting relatively liberal rules with respect to leased cars and the ability of leased cars to qualify for various tax incentives under the law, which I think the administration thinks will be a benefit to non-US manufacturers. I think we also saw this kind of effort to work with allies and partners to some degree in the tax guidance that the Treasury Department issued just on Friday of last week regarding the implementation of solar manufacturing tax credits, where there is a certain ways in which non-US firms building solar installations here in the US can qualify for elements of the bonus, not the total bonus for domestic production, but for elements of it, even where certain non-American parts are being used in the projects. And again, I think there's a statutory constraint that you see the administration trying to balance these goals. I think another way in which the administration is trying to work with allies and partners is the strong willingness, indeed even the embrace, of seeing of other countries that take similar industrial policy measures. Obviously, in the weeks and months after the IRA passed, you saw U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, senior White House climate official John Podesta, and other officials urge Europe, as well as other allies and partners, to enact their own industrial policies for clean energy. And I think that you're going to continue to see this White House argue that other countries should join in a rethinking of industrial policy. Going forward, I think you're going to see a focus on transparency around industrial policy measures, sharing of the kinds of subsidies and the types of subsidies and the value of the subsidies that might be granted to encourage certain investments, and trying to come up with some probably not legally binding frameworks, but some sort of shared concepts of specific products and sectors that should be covered by these kinds of subsidies. I should close this part of my remarks by saying that I'm relatively optimistic that the U.S. and its allies, first and foremost in Europe, will manage to muddle through. I think there's strong political incentive on both sides to manage through tensions, and I think there is a commitment on both sides to doing so. I also think that there's a strong degree of alignment on many of the views that Kai expressed in his remarks, both about the need to spur global investments, not just national investments to combat shared challenges like climate change, and also about his remarks on the need to bring other allies and new allies into our joint economic relations. And I'd like to close by making just a minute or so of remarks on the TTC, which I'm going to keep quite short because I really do endorse Fran's quite thoughtful set of remarks on the state of the TTC. But I think I'm just going to offer sort of 3 recommendations for the TTC going forward. The first is one that Fran really spoke about, which is the need to shift from a focus, not really a need to shift, but the need to try to change the public narrative from a focus on sort of specific concrete deliverables to a narrative that recognizes that a large part of the TTC is about relationship building and about working on longer term shared challenges. You know, I do think that the strength of the relationships and the connections that were built by the TTC in its first year was quite instrumental to the collective response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the export control space. And I think that really shows the value from the relationship and the understanding of each other's system that might not show up in a sort of specific TTC deliverable. Second, I want to echo one of the points that Fran made. I do think that AI presents a major opportunity for the TTC, in part because the legislative and regulatory processes on AI are in a relatively early stage of development on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that is going to make it easier to use the TTC to come up with a sort of shared approach and shared framework than with, you know, certain past regulations like DMA and DSA, where one country was really quite far down the line in developing its regulatory approach before the diplomatic negotiations really got underway. And here I might urge both sides to think about ways, particularly the US side, to include legislative actors in at least some of the discussions. We have obviously a bipartisan focus in our Congress on regulating AI. And from a US legal perspective, we're going to need Congress involved. I think it would be useful for the TTC to try to begin to socialize some of the staff, maybe, of members of Congress to some of the TTC thinking. Similarly, I would imagine on a European side. And then the final recommendation I have for the TTC, again picking up on Fran's remarks, is really to continue the focus on climate and to work through some of the challenges we are going to face around CBAM and also the Green Steel arrangement to come up with a joint US-EU approach to that. I think the kind of climate trade issues is clearly one of the major strategic sets of trade issues we're all going to face over the next several years. And I do think that is an area where the TTC could really come up with some specific shared values. Let me leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Peter, for those remarks and those recommendations. We do now have Matthias Krämer. Not on the screen as fully as we'd like, but Matthias, I believe you're there. You are, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I am sorry that I have really huge technical problems. So, but at last I'm in now, and I couldn't follow the first 30 minutes of this discussion. But as far as I see, we are still going on with the opening remarks. Is that correct? Or are we in the center of the discussion now?
No, that's correct. You are bringing us home with the opening remarks now.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Well, thank you so much for having me, and at least via telephone. So, well, as I did not hear what my colleagues said before me, I just want to give in some thoughts about the question of friendshoring and diversification, and also on the TTC, because here in Germany, of course, not since the terrible war in the Ukraine, we have a really big discussion about how to diversify our supply chains on the one hand, and how to diversify our international markets. And in any discussion that we have here in Berlin or in Brussels about trade policy, it's all about diversification. And but there is one problem from our point of view. I mean, of course, our member companies have in their international and global strategies. Overall, the thinking about how to bring resilience and efficiency in supply chains and also on markets into the right balance. And if you go more to the side of resilience, of course, it's becoming problematic because you have to find new markets on the one hand, and it becomes normally it becomes more costly, so it becomes more expensive. So you have to find the right balance between that, and the German government and also the European Commission tries now to fulfill some of the latest FTAs. For example, with Chile, we have negotiations with Mercosur and others, and we fully support this on behalf of the German industry. But on the other hand, we really have to be careful, because if you look, for example, on the FTA with India, for example, I mean, are we really sure that it will be possible for the Europeans to negotiate a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the Indians? Because not only that we would like to bring in our standards and values on behalf of the Europeans into the new markets with or by these free trade agreements, we also want to introduce those environmental, sustainability, ethical, and other values via sanctions. I mean, the European approach and also the approach of the German government in these days is that if we negotiate with new trading partners, new FTAs, they have to keep in mind that if they don't follow all these environmental and ecological standards, for example, there can be there might be any sanctions for these countries, and we are not sure if this really arises the attractiveness of the European Union as a free trade partner. So we have to be very careful with that, and maybe we also have to think about a discussion, how can we make new free trade agreements, well, on a modular base, for example, or like sequencing models. So, but we are right at the beginning of this discussion, and I am sure that the German industry will contribute to that. But I mean, if on the one hand we talk about diversification, and on the other hand about friendshoring, to us, the Trade and Technology Council is, if you want, one of the best tools that we have to live or to make friendshoring concrete. So that was the reason why around about 1.5 years ago, our federation, we founded a Transatlantic Business Initiative together with other 3 big associations here in Germany. And this Transatlantic Business Initiative tries to bring in the perspective of the German business sector into the transatlantic discussions in order to revitalize the transatlantic economic relations. And for us, the TTC is a great platform, and we are hugely supportive for that. And but in these days, we really have to say that the TTC is now standing at a crossroads. I mean, the last ministerial meeting fell short of expectations. It delivered only limited progress. So with the TTC's continuation following the 2024 US presidential elections, far from certain, the next ministerial meeting, which will take place by the end of May in Sweden, in the town, I can't really pronounce the name because I recently heard a Swedish colleague pronouncing it, and it's a pretty hard word. Luela, I think it's like it is. Well, and this meeting will mark a critical juncture. But nevertheless, the TTC proved an invaluable tool for transatlantic coordination following especially the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the success ultimately depends on both sides' ability to agree on concrete outcomes. Maybe we can come to this then in the discussion. Outcomes that are both commercially relevant and designed to outlast any potential change of leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. So we are looking forward, and we have already brought in our recommendations for the next TTC, and we are very keen what at the end of the day will take place in Sweden. And yeah, maybe I make a full stop here, and I'm happy now to discuss other details. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Let me remind the viewers that if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab. It should be at the bottom of your screen or elsewhere there. Kai Whittaker, since you started us off, Let me go back to something that you said and then ask others also to share their views. You made a strong point that that one of the defining features of international relations today is this battle between freedom and oppression, which of course we see in a very stark way with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but perhaps there are other ways that we're experiencing this. And of course, today's topic is friendshoring. And so my question is, how do we define who a friend is when you're talking about the international economy, when sometimes those friends may not be lining up with the United States or the Germany or the EU as strongly as some might like on some of the security issues? Can we have two tracks? Can we have a security track and then sort of on the economy a track which may be different? And is that useful?
Well, indeed, that is a bit of a difficult question to define who's one's friend and who's one's foe. I think what we haven't done so far, at least on the European side, I think the Americans are a bit more advanced in this, is judging, or not judging, but looking at the world map and see where potential conflicts, geopolitical conflicts arising, and which nations could harm us and in which way they could harm us, and then try to analyze how we can minimize the risk of those conflicts being or showing up in the world. And I think we have to do that in Europe now, because I mean, America is probably more advanced than that, but the American geopolitical situation is a bit better than the European, given the conflicts we have in Africa, given the Middle East. Our security issues are a bit more complex, so to speak. So that's one thing. The second thing is we have to learn that within friends there can be different opinions on any matter, and we have to deal with that in that way. That doesn't mean that we question our foundation on which the friendship is based on, but we have to get rid of that thinking which is if you're not with us, you're against us. That was probably the political stance in the early 2000s here in the United States. The world is a bit more complex now. And third, we have to really look on the long-term developments in each country. Are they developing towards free democratic nations or not? Ukraine is doing that. That's why we're helping them. They're not perfect. Not everything is working fine in Ukraine. It's not a brilliant state yet, but they made a huge progress in the past 15 years. That's why we're helping them. And that may apply to other nations in this world as well. And we have to be very careful if we shut down those doors too early, or whether we should keep them open and try to, well, invite them in, lure them in on our side. And that is a very delicate political task to do for the future. And I really hope that politicians on both sides of the pond have the sensitivity to see what the long-term trends in each country are.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on that about how we define a friend, or is it we just sort of know it when we see it? Fran.
So I think that actually the invasion of Ukraine has been a real dividing line. And I think, though, that you have to look not just at the countries that have supported Ukraine materially, but also at how votes have been going in the United Nations. I do think, though, that along with looking at who are friends, and you can see a couple of like outward going concentric circles of friendship, maybe, you also have to have a cross-cutting element to the matrix, which is, what are you talking about in terms of trade? Are you talking about consumer goods? Are you talking about strategic materials? I would say that the first, consumer goods, you could have continue to have trade in the normal everyday way, with price still as the lead determinant of where you trade. But there will be more diversification, because we've even seen like baby food shortages, right? And things like that. But with strategic sectors of the economy, you're going to see more looking at security and diversity as components above price or in league with price. And I think we have yet to work out who pays for that premium. Is that something that the state supports? You can't really expect that that companies will, over the long term, support a security premium unless they're legislated to do so in some way. So I think that's an issue. But I can see we talk too often about trade as if it's one thing, but there's consumer trade, there's agricultural trade, there's trade in strategic minerals, and we have to start differentiating when we talk about trade, unless we're just going to go back to the old way of it's all price, and that's all that matters, and it's free and open. And I think those days are gone.
So it's when we think about friendshoring, it's not, the metric shouldn't just be the name of the country, but what the goods are that are involved.
Yes. Yeah.
Peter or Matthias, anything on that topic? If not, I will take that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matthias. Yes,
maybe I just would like to add something to what Kai just said. I mean, of course, we have to be in a way flexible on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have to define red lines, and to find the right balance there is really an enormous challenge. But what Fran just said, or she asked, who will pay for the premium? I mean, I really have to say, if we talk about industrial policy, for example, in Germany and in Europe, which is, at least now we have a discussion about industrial policy, also due to the IRA. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act really generated this discussion, and for us, it's new territory in some way. But we really have to be careful that even in such times where we find the right balance between resilience and efficiency, and we can't fulfill all the goals of efficiency. It can't be the state and it can't be the government in order to protect or subsidize companies in that question. I would say that finding the right balance is sort of real entrepreneurial risk and well, task for action from my point of view.
Thank you, Matthias. Let me sort of take this issue and zoom out a bit. We've been talking, of course, because that's the title of our event, and that's, I think, where we should start, which is the U.S. and the EU. But I think there's also the question of where might and should the U.S. and the EU go. Once they together, they have a sense of who a friend is, what good should be, should fall on which side of a red line. And so, one could imagine going to the G7, which, for example, had some useful roles already this year on after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you then, of course, much broader, maybe more problematic, the World Trade Organization. So, my question would be, when we look a little bit in terms of this idea of broadening out to make sure we're being as inclusive as we can, and in terms of who the friends are, where should we go, or do we need even new kinds of some new structures to do that? And any thoughts on that issue of sort of going beyond the US and the EU?
Maybe I'll, Kai, did you want to go first?
No, go on. You were.
Yeah. Maybe I'll offer just a minute or two of remarks on that, Peter, and then I look forward to hearing from my other panelists. So first, I think you bring up the G7, and I think there is this kind of macro narrative the last 2 years, which I think will continue, about the kind of resurrection of the G7 as a coordinating body in international relations, right? Something had been kind of left for dead a number of years ago, but has really, I think, played a really instrumental role on Russia-Ukraine issues, on frankly, some of the coordination around the sort of tail end of the pandemic over the last couple of years. I think it's really been interesting to see that. And I do think that when it comes to, sort of supply chains and friendshoring, the G7 is a useful mechanism for kind of the core Western democracies to talk about, shared approaches to friendshoring, and to, sort of sectors that they want to focus on. Obviously, the G7, even with kind of guest members attending various G7 summits, is going to be limited in scope. And so I don't think it's really, it's a valuable mechanism for sort of core Western democracies to come together, but it's not really the, right table to bring in some of the countries in, North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America to come into it, because it's just not an open format. I think this is sort of an area that we're going to need to explore over the next couple of years. And I think it's ultimately something where the US and Europe, may have both overlap of countries that they want to bring in, but also some differences of countries that they want to bring in, not in a negative way, but simply as a result of geography, right? From a US perspective, you think about friendshoring on, certain manufactured goods, Mexico and parts of Central America, play very importantly there. I think that in a post-conflict Ukraine, for Europe, Ukraine could play some of that role. Obviously, you had Ukrainian role in friendshoring, but North Africa as well. So I think probably you're going to see slightly different overlapping architectures emerge over the next couple of years. And I think as between the US and Europe, the key thing will be kind of, transparency and non-discrimination as we set up these different sort of overlapping architectures.
Thanks, Matthias.
Yeah, I can share an impression with you. A couple of weeks ago, I took part in the Business 7 Summit in Tokyo. All the big 7 federations were invited by Keidan-Ren, our Japanese partner association. They have organized the B7 Summit, and even the Japanese Prime Minister, he opened the summit, and half of his cabinet were there, so it was quite interesting. And one thing was clear. The Japanese, and now from a European perspective, told us very directly that they have shown solidarity with regard to the situation in Europe, with regard to the war in Ukraine. We have all seen that the Japanese Prime Minister, he was in Kiev, he was with Volodymyr Zelensky, he went to Bucha, and that was really remarkable. And of course, it's now the turn of the Japanese telling us that in any case, whatever might happen in the Indo-Pacific, that they are also very interested in a high solidarity among the G7. And I think this strong solidarity, which is then open for other countries, it's not a closed shop, that might be a way to a certain success in order to make friendshoring again concrete. But the G7 countries really have to stand very close together, and they have to demonstrate that their way of living, that their way of democracy and so on might be an attractive model for other countries. But again, from a European or half European, half Asian perspective, you might know that yesterday in Turkey, the elections, that was a little bit surprising for me, because Erdogan, even he still has the majority, Recep Erdogan, but on the other hand, the economic system of the country is completely rotten. They have an inflation, they have such a high unemployment rate, and so on and so on. And even so, the people would vote for this man again. So I think we are really facing tough times as a G7 or as a Western community, but we should not give up, of course.
You asked the question, Peter, where
Yes.
should we go? And I think there are various options we can look at. Of course, there's Latin America, rather obvious one to go for because it's largely democratic. It's somehow approachable to Western way of living. The second is, as Matthias just said, that we have to look to the Pacific area. I think it was the UK or the US, Australia, New Zealand formed this, and Japan formed this Pacific group. Japan is really hoping, and South Korea as well, to ally itself to the United States for security reasons. And if you look on the voting pattern on the UN vote, as Franz said, even the ASEAN states voted in favor of condemning Russia, despite being not really democracies, but that was a very interesting development there. And so we have to think very carefully whether we as Europeans should also look to the Pacific if we want to make sure that our way of life is protected in this century. Germany did that, by the way, with a very small, tiny bit, but nevertheless important one. When we sent one of our boats of our army or Navy to the Pacific, I think a couple of years ago, that was the first for us, but a vital thing to do. And last year I was myself in Singapore to discuss the geopolitical developments in the Pacific area, and I was quite surprised that Europe actually has is a well-respected and highly reputed organization there, and that we have a strong hand to play, but we don't at the moment, and we should look into that. And the third one is, that's probably the most complicated one, is Africa. It is next to our, at least for our home door, front door, and many African countries voted also in favor of the UN vote. Not all of them, unfortunately, not South Africa. I'm really heartbroken by that, because we all think that South Africa is probably the most modern African nation we can think of in Western terms. But there are other nations, and we probably should approach them and see if we can open some doors there and show and highlight our case. If they ally, if they come with us, that they will benefit even more compared to for what China has to offer, for example.
Thank you. Fran, did you want to comment?
Yes, thank you. I think that I agree with what's been said by my fellow panelists, but I think we have a real challenge, particularly with those who are outside the immediate G7 circle, but who voted to condemn Russia, but who see the invasion as not really their problem. And that's a lot of countries, actually, and a lot of countries in the global South. And we can't make this just, some combination of the G7, the Five Eyes, et cetera, put together. That's just over the long term, not going to work. And so I think that we have to figure out how to shift the narrative in these countries, whether that is based on Russian disinformation, or whether it is Chinese investment that has brought this narrative. I think that some things that we're seeing in the TTC, such as joint US and EU funding of tech projects in Kenya and Jamaica, are an indication of a step in the right direction, but it's a teeny, 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 tiny step. And I think we need to figure out how we can have better outreach to countries to convince them that this is not just, the former imperial powers trying to persuade them to do something because we need them now. And really, it's not with their best interests at heart. So I think that this is going to be an ongoing discussion that we need to have, how to reach out to the fence sitters, if I would call them that.
Let me go back to the second institution I mentioned in the previous question, which I'm glad stimulated a lot of comment, which was the WTO. But or maybe the WTO at least is a shorthand for this notion that we need some kind of nearly universal trading system where there's at least a modicum of rules that all countries abide by. I mean, if I listen to the discussion, it does give me a certain optimism that on the transatlantic level, and perhaps, kind of a level up or out, there's particularly if we're kind of tolerant of the idea that we don't need immediate deliverables, as Peter was suggesting, that we're gonna find some common, not only common principles, but also some common actions. And then there's, a lot of domestic actions we're taking when we talk about subsidy races, trying to make sure that we're coordinating all that. And that all sounds great. The piece that I guess it seems to me much more up in the air is how do on the economic side, kind of big international institutions, of course, the WTO is the big one we've got. What is there a role for an organization like that? Of course, assuming that there's some needed reforms and it can be reforms, or are we probably more in an era for the next several years, let's say, where, we maintain the WTO on, we don't want to get rid of something until we have something to replace it. Of course, it has a lot of useful functions that it's built up, but that the action's really going to be elsewhere. Is that the right way to look at things? Anyone want to comment on that? Kai, what about you?
Well, the first thing that came up in my mind on that question is, we all know that China wants to change the rules in which we are, and the world in which we're living. And that is not only WTO, but they don't accept the UN framework at all. And they made that quite clear that they want to change that. And I suppose that they are going to change it in a way which we do not approve. So at the end of the day, there will be no change. So I don't see that we have constitutional or institutional reform on any UN or international organization of such a huge format, which then means that we have to find a way around to step up our game. And that is why, as Fran said, we need to think about some kind of new format, and it can't be just G7 plus annex. It must be something which is new, or at least so much developed that others can also identify with it as their project, and not something they've been cordially invited to join. And that's how I see it. I think we need to get a framework which is working around the current framework we have, unfortunately, as long as the things are as they are.
So if I put a sort of trade policy hat on, some kind of plurilateral approach, maybe is what you're saying. Fran or Peter, any thought on this issue of how we broaden?
Maybe I can add something.
Sorry, Matthias. Yeah. I didn't see
I
you, so I didn't. Sorry.
Unfortunately, I can't see if anybody has risen his hand. So, no, but I just wanted to add that this club thing. I mean, last year when Germany had the G7 presidency, they demanded a climate club, and we also, on behalf of the B7, we supported this idea of a climate club under some circumstances, of course. And this year, the Japanese friends, they have proposed a trade and free investment club, also within the G7, but also be opened for other countries. So maybe this club idea could be an approach. But nevertheless, I really have to say, and this is something that I also feel and notice within the membership of our federation, there is a certain WTO fatigue. People are a little bit unnerved, and they don't see that it can't, that will be able to reform itself, and so on and so on. And I mean, of course, we have enormous problems and challenges, but nevertheless, we always should emphasize that the WTO is of high value for all of us. And we just recently published a paper where we described all these challenges on the one hand, but we really would, on behalf of BDI, we really try to keep the light burning, if you want, with regard to Geneva, to the WTO, because it's the fundamental and it's the base of a high percentage of daily business that we proceed. We should not forget about that. Maybe before the next ministerial meeting, the WTO itself should not overload its own reform agenda, maybe, in order to prevent us from any disappointments. But please join us. Please be loud for the WTO. Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I guess, although I take Matthias's point, and I do think, Peter, as you said at the beginning, I think there is obviously some value to having kind of a baseline set of rules that all countries would adhere to. I mean, not to sort of state the obvious, but some of the premises of friendshoring is that actually we want to have different trading relationships with friends rather than having kind of a universal trading system. And I do think it's going to be quite challenging for the WTO over the next couple of years, not only because I think China, will block any reform that would sort of address some of the longstanding concerns we've had about China, but because I look at the actions on industrial policy the U.S. is taking, right? I think most WTO lawyers would probably say the Inflation Reduction Act violates U.S. WTO commitments. I mean, and I think the reality is that because we are in kind of a time of reconsidering not only trade policy, but also some of our domestic economic approach, it's going to be very hard to sort of think through what binding international disciplines and rules would be on a universal basis over the next, sort of 1 to 3 years. And so I think that probably, as you say, Peter, no one wants to get rid of the WTO. I think we would sort of leave it out there, but that probably the focus of action is going to be on a plurilateral approach. I mean, I do wonder if, and I see one of the questions, sort of Q&A in the chat. I do wonder if over the next couple of years, while we are all sort of developing our own kind of regional frameworks for friendshoring, I do wonder if a few years from now, there will be a desire or an impetus for more of a, kind of 40 or 50 country sort of friendshoring type arrangement, something like, if not the original GATT, maybe the GATT of the 1960s, which really brought in, a bunch of sort of several dozen like-minded allies into both developed and developing into kind of a shared trading agreement.
Thanks. Any last word before I try my best to wrap up this very rich discussion? Well, then hearing none, let me just first of all thank all of you for your contributions, and of course thank the viewers. I think that this was a very useful discussion. I take away that since I'm looking ahead at the TTC meeting coming up at the end of the month in the somewhat difficult to pronounce town in Sweden, I take away that we need a little bit of patience. A lot of these issues are issues of building common views, and there are a lot of management that has to be done. But I also, would say that I see that the participants in the TTC need to take their role and ambition very seriously, because from what I take away is that these kinds of strong bilateral efforts among like-minded countries to friendshore, which could be the basis for broader efforts, are really going to be where the action is. So looking forward to seeing what comes out of the meeting end of the May, and looking forward to staying in touch with all of you. So thanks so much to the four of you for participating. So long.